10 brutal facts about traveling the Old West to California in a covered wagon. And when I say brutal, I don't mean inconvenient. I don't mean difficult. I mean the kind of truth that makes you sit very still for a moment and think about the people who actually did this. People like you, like your grandparents' grandparents, ordinary American families, farmers, blacksmiths, mothers with infants on their hip, who looked west one morning, made a decision, and walked into something that almost no one fully understood until they were already in the middle of it. This is their story, not the painted version, the real one. The journey was nearly 2,000 miles, and most of them walked every step. The covered wagon looked like shelter. It looked like home, a canvas roof stretched over wooden bows, a rolling house that would carry a family to a new life in California. But here is what nobody tells you about that wagon. There was almost no room to sit in it. By the time a family packed what they needed, 800 pounds of flour, 200 pounds of lard, 700 pounds of bacon, beans, salt, coffee, tools, spare wheels, cooking pots, water kegs, the wagon was full. Not full the way a moving truck is full the way a life raft is full. Every inch was spoken for. So they walked. The husband walked. The older children walked. The wife, if she wasn't nursing an infant, walked. From western Missouri all the way to California, nearly 2,000 miles, most immigrants made that journey on foot, beside their wagon, through the same mud and heat and dust their oxen were pushing through. By summer's end, many of them were doing it barefoot. Their shoes had simply worn out, and there was nothing left to replace them. They had a 5-week window to leave. Miss it, and the mountains would kill them. Timing the journey west was not a preference. It was a matter of life and death, and the window was brutally narrow. Leave too early, before late April, and there would be no grass on the prairie for the oxen to eat. The animals would starve within weeks, and a wagon train without healthy oxen went nowhere. Leave too late, after the end of May, and you would not reach the Sierra Nevada before the first winter storm sealed the mountain passes. And if those passes closed while you were still on the wrong side of them, you were not delayed, you were trapped. This was not a theoretical risk. Every family knew what had happened to the Donner Party just a few years before. 87 people, men, women, children, had left too late in 1846, trusted the wrong guidebook, and found themselves snowbound in the Sierra Nevada as winter closed in around them. 42 of them never came out. So emigrants gathered at the Missouri River in late April, watching the calendar the way sailors watch a storm. And once the grass turned green enough to sustain their animals, they moved, because the mountain had a deadline, and it didn't negotiate.
The guidebook that killed people. In 1845, a young Ohio lawyer named Lansford Hastings published a book called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. He was 27 years old. He was ambitious and confident and had visions of empire. He wanted to settle California, build his own republic, and install himself as its leader. To do that, he needed people, so he wrote a guide. In it, he described a shortcut, a new route south of the Great Salt Lake that he claimed would save emigrants hundreds of miles and weeks of travel. He called it better. He called it easier. He promised to meet travelers personally at Fort Bridger and lead them through it himself. There was one problem. He had never actually traveled the cutoff with wagons. He had barely traveled it at all. James Reed, heading west with the Donner Party in the summer of 1846, encountered an old friend at Fort Laramie, a man who had just come east through Hastings' route and had seen its reality firsthand. "Take the regular trail," the friend warned him. "Wagons cannot make it through." Reed listened politely, and then he ignored the warning. What the Donner Party found on Hastings' cutoff was not a shortcut. It was an 80-mile waterless desert crossing that Hastings had told them would take 2 days. It took 5. They lost dozens of cattle. They abandoned wagons. They arrived at the California Trail a full month behind schedule, and the Sierra Nevada winter was waiting. Tamsin Donner, George Donner's wife, had said from the beginning that Hastings was a selfish adventurer and that she was gloomy and dispirited about turning off the main trail. She was right, and her instinct was ignored. The decisions men make, the women who see it clearly, the mountain that keeps score.
Cholera could kill you by nightfall. In the spring of 1849, something invisible moved through the wagon trains gathering at the Missouri River. It came from contaminated water, water that dozens of people and hundreds of animals were drinking from the same shallow creeks and riverbanks. Nobody knew that yet. Germ theory was still years from being understood. What they knew was what they saw. A man who was perfectly healthy at breakfast could be dead by supper. Cholera worked that fast. Cramps so severe that survivors described watching their companions literally fold in half. Vomiting, dehydration so profound the body could no longer regulate itself. Death, sometimes within hours of the first symptom. One diarist named Alphonse Day wrote about stopping the wagon when a companion named William Fisher fell ill. They stopped at noon. By 1 o'clock that same afternoon, Fisher was dead. This was the trying time on us, Day wrote, as it was unexpected to all. Another emigrant, after counting graves along the first stretch of trail, wrote something far simpler. "Oh, do not leave my bones here." Between 1849 and 1855, cholera killed an estimated 6,000 to 12,000 people on the California Trail alone. That is roughly one death every 17 steps of the journey's most disease-ridden stretch. And the people dying were not the weak or the careless. They were simply the unlucky. People who drank from the wrong pool, who camped a half-mile downstream from a party that had just buried their own sick. They kept moving because stopping felt like dying faster. The wagon weighed the wrong amount, and it cost them everything. The recommended maximum load for a covered wagon was 1,600 pounds. The wagon could technically hold 2,500, and nearly every family that left Missouri had packed somewhere in between, because when you are leaving your home forever, when you are deciding what survives and what disappears, every object carries a weight that has nothing to do with pounds. The rocking chair your grandmother left you, the iron stove you saved 3 years to buy, the trunk of your wedding china. They packed it all, and the oxen pulled it across the first flat prairie miles without complaint, and everything felt possible. Then they hit the mountains. At the base of every major climb, the trail was littered with the abandoned possessions of people who had the same thought too late. Furniture, cast iron cookware, barrels of food they could no longer carry, trunks of clothing, mirrors, books. One traveler described a piano sitting alone in the Nevada desert, gleaming and perfectly intact, like something from a dream, 40 miles from the nearest human settlement. The emigrants called this the elephant, the moment the journey showed you its true face, the moment you understood that you had brought too much of the old life, and the new life was going to cost you more than you planned. Decisions made in a parlor in Illinois, paid for in the Nevada sun.
The 40-mile desert, the worst 40 miles in America. Between the end of the Humboldt River in Nevada and the Carson River, the gateway to the Sierra Nevada, there was a stretch of alkaline desert that the emigrants called the 40-mile desert. It was not exactly 40 miles, it was closer to 50, and there was no water on it. None. Not a spring, not a creek, not even a mud hole. Emigrants had to gather as much water as their barrels could hold on the eastern side. Then they would typically begin the crossing at night, when the temperature dropped enough to make it survivable, and push through without stopping. The ground on the approach to the Carson River was covered with debris, not the random debris of carelessness, but the deliberate jettisoning of people in survival mode.
Dead animals lined the trail so thickly that travelers reported the smell before they could see the desert itself. A count made in 1850 documented what had been left behind in a single season: over 1,000 dead mules, nearly 5,000 dead horses, more than 3,000 dead cattle, and 953 emigrant graves. When the oxen finally scented the Carson River ahead of them, something broke loose in the animals. One traveler described it: they raised their dust-caked heads, broke into a run, a full stampede, and could not be stopped until they had plunged neck-deep into the water. He wrote that their red tongues had been hanging from their mouths, swollen with thirst the entire crossing. And behind those stampeding oxen, at the end of 2,000 miles of trail, a wagon with flapping canvas sides, still rolling. Fewer than 1 in 4 women wanted to go. Most westward journeys began with a man's decision. Historians who have studied the women's diaries, the journals and letters that women kept on the trail with a regularity and honesty that their husbands often didn't bother to match, found something striking. Fewer than 1 in 4 women who wrote about the decision to emigrate agreed with it. Why are we going on this foolhardy errand, separating ourselves from the networks at home that undergird our lives? Those networks meant everything. Sisters, mothers, the neighbor woman who helped you through childbirth, the church community, the doctor 2 streets over, the web of relationships that made ordinary life manageable. On the trail, a woman managed the wagon's interior, the supplies, the cooking, the children, while also walking miles every day. She nursed the sick in moving vehicles with no suspension on rutted ground. She gave birth on the prairie. She buried children she had carried 2,000 miles in the hope of a better life. And she did it, most of it, without complaint in the written record, not because she felt no grief, but because complaint was not something the situation had room for. She had made a different kind of decision than her husband. His decision was to go. Hers was to go too. And that distinction, small as it sounds, cost her something she never fully got back. The Sierra Nevada was the last decision, and it came at the end of everything. By the time emigrants reached the base of the Sierra Nevada, they had already been traveling for 4 to 5 months. Their food was running low, their animals were exhausted. Many of them were sick or had recently been sick. The clothing on their backs was not what they had started with. And then they looked up. The Sierra Nevada rose before them like a wall, not a hill, not a grade, a wall of granite and pine, and in bad years, snow. The passes sat at elevations above 7,000 feet. Getting a loaded wagon up those grades required lashing chains to trees and hauling wagons up with sheer human and animal force, inch by inch. It could take 2 to 3 days to get a single wagon over a single pass. The rule on the trail, the rule everyone knew, was reach the Sierra Nevada by mid-October at the absolute latest, because after that, the storms came. The Donner Party reached Donner Pass on October 31st, 1846. In a good year, that would have been survivable. 1846 was not a good year. The first storm hit 2 days later. The passes sealed, and 87 people who had walked 2,000 miles, who had made every hard decision, survived every disease, crossed every desert, found themselves inside the thing they had spent the entire journey trying to avoid. 12-year-old Virginia Reed survived. She wrote a letter to her cousin in Illinois after her rescue that said simply, "I have not wrote you half of the trouble, but I have wrote you enough to let you know what trouble is. Don't let this letter dishearten anybody." She was 12 years old. The graves were invisible. and that was deliberate. The California Trail, at its most brutal stretch, carried an average of 10 graves for every mile of trail. 10 per mile. But you would not have seen them, not because the dead were few, but because the living deliberately hid them. Families buried their dead in the middle of the trail itself. Then they drove their wagons over the grave. Then they drove their livestock across it. Then they scattered debris on top. Not out of disrespect, out of love, because the alternative was to leave a clearly marked mound in open country, and wolves and coyotes could smell what lay beneath. Families could not bear that, so they hid their dead beneath the very road that thousands of other travelers would walk across, never knowing. Men, women, children, buried under the feet of strangers, under the wheels of wagons belonging to people chasing the same dream they had started out chasing before the trail changed the shape of everything. One immigrant wrote of watching a man buried without ceremony beside the trail while the camp ate breakfast. They finished eating, they packed the wagon, and 10 minutes after the last shovelful of earth, the wagon train moved on. He wrote, "Many an unmarked grave lies by the old emigrant road. Brave souls gave up the battle and lie there forgotten, with not even a stone to note the spot where they sleep." The trail kept no record. The prairie kept everything.
Most of them made it, and that is the most remarkable fact of all. Here is the thing that gets lost in every account of danger and suffering and impossible decisions. Roughly 250,000 people traveled the California Trail between the 1840s and 1869. And despite the cholera, despite the deserts, despite the mountains, the impossible weight of the wagons, the 5-week window, the bad guidebooks, and the graves hidden beneath the road, most of them arrived. They came in as farming families from Illinois and Ohio and Missouri. They arrived as the people who would build California. They planted the orchards and raised the barns and opened the stores and built the towns that their grandchildren would grow up taking completely for granted. They could not have known that, standing at the Missouri River in April, the prairie spreading west in front of them, the grass just green enough, the oxen rested and ready. They could not have known what the journey would cost them or what it would make of them. They only knew the decision in front of them: go or stay. And 2,000 miles later, bruised and thin and barefoot in some cases, they stepped into California, and they didn't go back.